Mammals are some of the most diverse animals on the planet, filling an unimaginable number of niches and spreading to every corner of the planet. One of the most recognisable groups of living mammals that can be found in many of the world's forests are deer, an amazing lineage of animals that humans have long been fascinated with. The evolutionary history of deer is a very interesting topic, and at many points in the past they actually grew to some pretty enormous sizes, with some species having antlers that could span 3.5 meters across, or about 11 feet. So join me, Emilia, as we travel back through prehistory to examine every time that giant deer evolved, and it happened a surprising number of times. Most groups of deer started out as small animals with simple antlers, and many convergently evolved giant body sizes and incredibly complicated antlers seemingly independent of each other. Deer are a part of the order Artiodactyla, also known as the even-toed ungulates. This means they have an even number of toes, normally 2 or 4, as opposed to odd-toed ungulates, such as rhinos and horses, which have 1 or 3. Artiodactyla first appeared in the early Eocene epoch, around 55 million years ago, starting out as small rabbit-sized mammals with slim builds and long legs. The genus Diacodexis is considered the earliest true member of Artiodactyla, and lived in North America, Europe and Western Asia. Within Artiodactyla are the suborders Suiformes, which contains pigs, wild boar and peccaries, and Whippomorpha, which include the hippos and, incredibly, the whales. There's also Ruminarcha, which contain many different families, including Cervidae, the family which all true deer are in. The suborder Ruminantia is distinct because of the development of the ruminating gut, an adaptation in their digestive system that allows them to ferment food in a specialised stomach to better absorb nutrients. This suborder is the most diverse group of any living hoofed mammal, containing many different animals including bovids and, of course, deer and their relatives. Within this suborder is the infraorder Pecora, which encompasses the horned ruminants such as goats, sheep, giraffes and the focus of the video, deer. The first ruminants with horned appendages appeared during the Miocene epoch. They evolved in a number of different places and habitats. While the ancestors of giraffes evolved in open environments, early deer lived in more forested regions. This diversification occurred so rapidly that it is considered to be related to the major climate fluctuations during the time. The remains of early horned ruminants are often very fragmentary and have basal features, such as with the genus Andigomeryx, so their true evolutionary path is often highly debated. Deer themselves are within the family Cervidae, which appeared during the Middle Miocene about 16 million years ago. The earliest deer had small, simple antlers and tusks. These tusks receded over time, at which point deer diversified massively, eventually developing complex body plans and the antlers that we know and love today. The genera Euprox and Dicroceros are thought to be some of the earliest deer. They lived in Europe and Asia, so the exact point of origin for deer still remains a mystery. If you would like a truly in-depth video on deer evolution, please let me know. It's a fascinating topic and I would love to go into the details on the fossils and evolutionary lineages. But today we are covering Cervidae, using the umbrella term deer to describe the many different tribes and genera that exist within it. It should be noted that despite their names and superficial resemblance, the musk deer and mouse deer are currently understood to not be deer at all, and belong to their own families within Ruminarcha. Let's focus on the biggest, weirdest and coolest deers throughout history. Surprisingly, there are quite a lot of them. We'll be covering these deer in order of their age, so there'll be plenty of massive and unusual deer interspersed throughout this list. Our first deer is Brezia sudalces. B. sudalces lived in North America during the early Pliocene around 5 million years ago. It is notable for being one of the first species of deer to make it to North America, and is one of the proposed ancestors to all New World deer. Not much has been found of this species, just parts of its jaws, legs and most of the antlers. It wasn't that big, only about the size of a mule deer at just over a metre tall at the shoulder. Its antlers are its most notable feature, as they seem to have convergently evolved a similar broad shape as the fallow deer and the American moose, which would evolve much later. Its first tine was also extremely long. It also had an extremely small geographic range. B. sudalces was restricted to only Washington state, while its sister species, Brezia nebraskensis, which was the only other species in the genus, could only be found in Nebraska and South Dakota. While B. Cervalces would go extinct around 3.5 million years ago, B. nebraskaensis survived until the early Holocene 10,000 years ago, making this one of the longest living genera of deer ever. I think we got off to a good start with that one. Next in our cohort is Sinomegaceros. This genus lived from the late Pliocene through to the late Pleistocene. Closely related to Megaloceros, which we will talk about later, every species of this genus supported unique and unusual antlers. Because the best distinction between species is their antlers, which aren't always present with their fossils, the true relationship of evolutionary history between the species isn't well defined. All members of the genus lived throughout Central and East Asia. The earliest member of the genus, Sinomegaceros tadzikestanus, first appeared in the late Pliocene, and from here its descendants would radiate into at least 6 different species with unique antlers. The final member, Sinomegaceros ordocyanus, went extinct at the end of the Ice Age, around 20,000 years ago, possibly hunted to extinction by Homo sapiens, so this lineage was around for quite a while. Some of the earliest species reached sizes rivaling the largest deer of all time. S. tadzikestanus was almost as heavy as the famous Megaloceros giganteus, while a currently unidentified intermediate species reached a body mass estimated at 560 kilograms, as heavy as an adult male M. giganteus. The award for the most extreme antlers of the genus goes to Sinomegaceros pachyosteus, whose antlers were, well, the only word for it is big. As the species name suggests, it had extreme pachyostosis, a thickening of the bones either for buoyancy control in aquatic animals or for heavy collisions in deer and goats. You can see this in the mandible and cranium particularly, reinforcing the skull for impacts, possibly for fighting between males if present deer behaviour is any indication. The pachyostosis also provides mineral storage for antler growth. Next up are the branch-antlered deer of the genus Eucladoceros. They ranged from the late Pliocene around 3 million years ago to the early Pleistocene of Eurasia. Their evolutionary history is debated, but the closest living relatives are thought to be the southern Asian genus Rucer and Cervus, which includes red deer and elk. Reaching a maximum height of 1.5 metres at the shoulder, they were not the biggest of big deer, likely no larger than a modern-day red deer. What makes Eucladoceros really unique are their gigantic antlers that varied widely between species. Members of Eucladoceros, such as Eucladoceros dicranios, boasted some of the largest antlers of any deer, particularly in contrast to their smaller body size. As mentioned earlier, Eucladoceros dicranios is probably the most striking, but Eucladoceros tenoides is also very cool. Next, we have Praemegaceros. While most species of this genus were not as large as our later entries, they are actually related to the famous Megaloceros and part of the so-called giant deer tribe, Megaceroides, alongside Sinomegaceros and Megaloceros. These deer also had unusual antlers, with each species bearing different unique morphologies. They were found from the early Pleistocene, over 2 million years ago, all the way into the Holocene epoch in Eurasia, which is the epoch we're still currently in. They were particularly common in Britain, Europe and Central Asia. The subgenus Nesolipoceros had insular forms that lasted into the early Holocene, making them one of the youngest deer on the list. The species Praemegaceros obscurus and Praemegaceros verticornis had incredible antlers, appearing extremely bent and twisted. Next we have the broad-fronted moose Cervalces latifrons. This is an ancestor of the American moose and the largest deer on our list. Indeed, the largest deer to have ever lived. Appearing in the early Pleistocene over 2 million years ago, this species would go extinct at the end of the Middle Pleistocene, around 130,000 years ago, likely being outcompeted by its descendants, the modern European moose. Despite its relatively small antlers, spanning only 2.5 metres compared to Megaloceros' 3.5 metres antler span, C. latifrons was twice the mass of Megaloceros. It reached a shoulder height of nearly 2.5 metres and could weigh as much as 1,200 kilograms. So pretty big. Cervalces scotti, which will appear later in this list, is considered to evolve from a group of C. latifrons that migrated to America during the Middle Pleistocene. However, C. latifrons have not been found in America themselves. Cervalces scotti remains the only member of the genus to have ever been discovered in America, so its true origin is currently unknown. Actual fossils of C. latifrons have been found throughout Europe and Asia, with the original holotype fossil for the species being found here in England. It's unknown whether they had a prehensile lip, basically a lip that acts as a proboscis, an adaptation to aquatic feeding. So C. latifrons' face may have resembled a deer more than what we think of a moose today. C. latifrons' antlers were unique, even compared to the modern American moose, with the initial main beam growing parallel to the ground before branching into a broad star-like shape of many tines. Next up, Rucervus gigans. Now this is what you call a big deer. This absolute unit lived from the early Pleistocene of Greece, around a million years ago. Because it was described very recently in 2018, not many fossils of this species exist, so its current date of extinction is unknown. While it's only known from relatively fragmentary material, it's been hypothesized to rival Megaloceros in size. Its limbs were comparatively much longer, with its metacarpals the same length as its ulnar and radius, probably giving it a very strange appearance in life. A complete antler has yet to have been found, but remains suggest they were not quite as dramatic as those of Megaloceros. The authors of our Gigans' holotype paper have suggested that its long legs reflect the fact that it occupied the niche of a high-level browser, meaning this deer lived more like a giraffe than any other species of deer living or extinct. Rucervus as a genus still exists today with two extant members, Rucervus duvalselli, the swamp deer, and Rucervus eldi, Eld's deer. Rucervus schomburgii unfortunately went extinct in 1938 due to habitat loss and hunting. Deer within this genus are characterised by their unique antler structure, where the basal ramification has an additional small prong and there is never a middle tine. Our gigans is currently not thought to be ancestral to any living member of the genus, instead being an unusual offshoot. Next, we're on to the much talked about Megaloceros. But first we will discuss Megaloceros savini, not the one everyone thinks of, Megaloceros giganteus. M. savini lived in the Middle Pleistocene of Europe, between 750,000 to 450,000 years ago. This species is of course closely related to M. giganteus, but is now considered to possibly be of its own distinct genus, Praemegaceros, because of how unique it is. This species was smaller than M. giganteus, comparable with a modern-day reindeer, and had straighter, sharper antlers. While this species is thought to be very closely related to M. giganteus, it is likely not its direct ancestor. It was, however, a direct ancestor of the slightly larger Megaloceros matritensis, an animal that lived in Europe around 350,000 years ago. This deer had features that indicated it had a unique, currently unknown diet, and seems to have been regularly hunted by the early humans living in the area. Now you may have heard of Clacton, a seaside town in Essex in the UK. We have likely mentioned it once or twice in previous videos, as it plays an important role in paleoanthropology, but did you know it had its own deer? The Clacton fallow deer, Dama clactoniana, lived in the Middle Pleistocene of Britain around 700,000 to 200,000 years ago. Remains have been found throughout Europe, but the majority come from Britain, particularly the Clacton area. It is thought to be the direct ancestor of the modern fallow deer, Dama, but was around 20% larger and had more complex antlers with an accessory tine. Next we have the stag moose, Cervalces scotti, which we mentioned earlier. Like the modern moose, this animal is also a direct descendant of the broad-fronted moose, making it a sister species of sorts to the modern moose. It was comparable in size to the American moose, but had longer legs and larger, more complex antlers. It lived in a similar region, making it to North America just like its modern-day relative. C. scotti went extinct at the very end of the Ice Age, 11,700 years ago. All in all, it was quite similar to the broad-fronted moose. And now we have at last come to the much discussed Megaloceros giganteus, also known as the Irish elk. While it was not the largest deer to have ever lived, it did have the largest antlers by far, reaching up to 3.5 metres across, an astounding length. Despite being extremely recognisable and a common fossil, its evolutionary history is not fully known. Its evolution appears to have begun outside of Western Europe, but its exact ancestor is still contested to this day. The oldest accurately dated and definitive fossils of the animal are from Hoxne in England, dating to between 425,000 and 375,000 years ago. Megaloceros was extremely common in the late Pleistocene, and its closest living relative is actually the fallow deer, a deer that unfortunately did not make this list, it was just a bit too small. Megaloceros went extinct in England a mere 11,000 years ago, but persisted in Russia until just before 7,000 years ago, so a very long-lived and widespread species. The majority of their remains are from Ireland. In fact, the last remains from the British Isles were found in Irish bogs, hence its popular name, the Irish elk, despite Megaloceros not being exclusively Irish, nor an elk. Next up is Megaceroides algericus. This one is really cool. This is another animal that is suspected to be closely related to Megaloceros. In fact, it has often been suggested to actually belong within the genus Megaloceros itself. I'm seeing a pattern here. It lived in Africa from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene, and was one of 2 species of deer to ever make it to the African continent, the other one being a population of red deer, Cervus elaphus. What's really unfortunate is the latest remains of M. algericus date to just 4,500 BC, making it one of the most recently extinct giant animals on the planet. Its extinction coincides with the death of many megafaunal species in the area, such as the African aurochs and the gigantic buffalo Sinomegaceros antiquus. As usual, it's thought that human overhunting killed these guys off. It's really unfortunate that we were so close to seeing such an incredible variety of animals. M. algericus wasn't massive, being slightly smaller than a red deer, but it had a really unique appearance. Its skull was the stockiest and widest of any known deer, appearing very boxy when viewed from above, almost like a bison's skull. Isolated limb bones found elsewhere that have been hypothesized to belong to M. algericus suggest the entire animal was very stocky and robust. Cave art found in the region also contains an unusual horned animal with antler tines in certain cases, which has been hypothesized to belong to this species. Interestingly, this animal is often portrayed as possessing an unusually long tail, something not seen in modern deer, possibly indicating M. algericus had a long flowing tail, like a horse. It also had one of the most extreme cases of pachyostosis, or bone thickening, of any living mammal. In living deer, pachyostosis in the skull is thought to provide nutrients to the antlers, possibly indicating this guy had some crazy antler structure going on. But it also has been suggested that this extreme pachyostosis could be an adaptation to protect against crocodile attacks. That's because it has been suggested that M. algericus was a semi-aquatic animal. Despite having an extremely wide jaw and heavily built skull, the front part of its lower jaw was incredibly weak, possibly indicating it lived off a diet of soft aquatic plants. Its stocky build and thick, robust skull may possibly indicate another unique part of its lifestyle, competing in headbutting competitions with rival members of its own species, more similar to an ibex or muskox than other deer. Getting close to the end now, we have the steppe reindeer, Rangifer tarandus constantini. This extinct subspecies of the modern reindeer lived in the steppe plains of Europe and Asia, as the name suggests. It lived to about 20,000 years ago, and interestingly, even though it's called the steppe reindeer, suggesting it lived in freezing environments, the volume of its nasal cavity was much smaller than that of the modern reindeer, indicating it had fewer adaptations to the cold than its modern day counterpart. This possibly explains how it became extinct. It was simply outcompeted by the modern day reindeer, which had better adaptations to the cold. The antlers of this animal indicate that the steppe reindeer was slightly larger than the largest modern reindeer. This might be due to Bergmann's rule, a phenomenon in which populations of animals that live in colder climates evolve larger body sizes to conserve heat. Its skull also had adaptations to graze in more open grassland environments, suggesting that this guy was quite a bit different from modern reindeer. It's been suggested to belong to its own species entirely, Rangifer constantini, rather than just a subspecies. And last but definitely not least, we have the Alaskan moose, Alces gigans. This is the largest living deer, with males being about 40% larger than females. Males can stand over 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weigh almost 640 kilograms. The size of their bodies and antlers varies widely based on their genetics and diet. Despite being such giant animals, the Asian Chukotka moose, a regional population of the Eurasian moose, often rivals them in body size. The Asian Chukotka moose has the largest antlers of any living animal. Finally we have come to the end of our list. But before we sign off, we thought it best to list a few honourable mentions. Deer that just didn't quite make the list. The red deer, Cervus elaphus, and the reindeer, Rangifer tarandus, are still absolutely massive and are still up there with some of the largest deer to have ever lived, and they are extant, which means you can go see them, which is pretty cool. Now, as we were writing this, we actually found too many deer to include in this video, or it would have become like an hour and a half long, and I wouldn't want to sit through that. So if you have any other cool deer that you want us to include in a part 2, possibly, let us know. There are a few we had to leave out the list that we've already written parts of, so it's up to you whether you want it or not. If you enjoyed the video or not, please let us know. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. The response to our suggestion of a video on big deer was so enthusiastic we couldn't help but do it. And really, who knew there would be so many to cover? So many. Thank you so much for all your support. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you next time. It doesn't quite fit in the frame, but I wanted to show off the big red deer antler that I found, probably Neolithic. It's missing its tine, but it probably would have been like a bit long. So you can imagine how big some of the other deer antlers would be if this is hard to hold. Yeah, I just wanted to show off.